In the gilded cage of the London season, whispers are sharper than knives. For Miss Beatrice Ainsworth, a woman of modest birth but immense character, every ballroom was a battlefield. They judged her gowns, mocked her quiet nature, and invented scandals from thin air. She was a ghost at the feast, a shadow against the glittering walls, invisible to all but the gossips who fed on her supposed flaws. But they never noticed the one pair of eyes that truly saw her, the cold, calculating gaze of Duke Alistair Beaumont, a man who loathed their world, yet commanded it completely. They thought they were destroying her, but they were merely setting the stage for a revelation that would bring the entire ton to its knees. The air in the Marquis of Salisbury's ballroom was thick with the scent of wilting roses and expensive perfume, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the bitter undercurrent of malice. Hundreds of candles blazed in the crystal chandeliers above, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light on the dancers below. It was a light that exposed every flaw, every tremble of a lip, every desperate glance. For Miss Beatrice Ainsworth, it felt less like a glow and more like an interrogation lamp. Standing near a marble column draped in ivy, she clutched her modest dance card as if it were a shield. It remained stubbornly, painfully empty. This was her third major event of the season, and the pattern was cruelly familiar. She would arrive with her chaperone, the kind but increasingly anxious Mrs. Gable find a quiet corner and proceed to be systematically ignored by every eligible gentleman and openly dissected by every fashionable lady. Look at her. A sharp voice hissed from a nearby gaggle of debutantes. Beatrice didn't need to see the speaker to know it was Lady Cressida Vance, the season's reigning belle, a diamond of the first water with a heart of pure ice. The fabric of that gown must have been frightfully inexpensive. It hangs on her like a shroud. A ripple of cruel laughter followed. Beatrice's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on a large oil painting of a naval battle across the room. Her father, a simple country doctor, who had poured every spare shilling into her education, and this one disastrous season had always told her that dignity was a fortress. Tonight, the walls of that fortress felt perilously thin. Her crime, as far as the ton was concerned, was threefold. First, her family, the Ainsworths, were genteel, but possessed neither a grand title nor a vast fortune. They had a respectable country estate and a name that was old but not illustrious. Second, she was not a conventional beauty. She had a thoughtful face, intelligent grey eyes, and a quiet grace that was utterly lost in a society that valued dazzling smiles and flirtatious giggles. Third, and perhaps most damningly, she did not play their games. She did not flatter, she did not feign ignorance, and she could not bring herself to engage in the vapid chatter that passed for conversation. They say her father is merely a country physician, another voice belonging to Miss Eleanor Finch. Cressida's chief sycophant chimed in. Practically a tradesman. It's a wonder she was even allowed past the doors of Salisbury House. Beatrice flinched the insult to her father, stinging more than any comment about her dress. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself of the promise she'd made to him that she would endure, that she would try to find a respectable match to secure her future, as was the duty of a woman in her position. But duty felt a long way from the shimmering, hostile reality of this ballroom. From across the vast, crowded room, a man watched the scene unfold with an unnerving stillness. Duke Alistair Beaumont stood half-shrouded in the shadows of an alcove, his presence a pocket of cold silence in the cacophony of the ball. He was known as the Winter Duke, a man whose title was as old as the Norman conquest, and whose fortune was immeasurable. He was dark-haired, with eyes the colour of a stormy sea, and a face that looked as if it were carved from granite. He had returned from the Napoleonic Wars a hero, but the conflict had stripped him of all warmth, leaving behind a man of formidable intellect and chilling self-control. He detested these events, these cattle markets, where breeding and bank accounts were paraded with all the subtlety of a circus. He attended only when duty to his station made it unavoidable, and when he did, he observed the machinations of the ton with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying a particularly venomous species of insect. His gaze had fallen on Beatrice Ainsworth at the start of the season. At first he had barely registered her. She was plain quiet and seemingly unremarkable. But as the weeks passed, he began to notice her resilience. He saw how the other debutantes led by the venomous Cressida, Vance, circled her like sharks. He saw the snubs, the turned shoulders, the whispers that followed her like a miasma. Yet he never saw her crumble. He saw her chin lift, her back straighten. He saw the quiet intelligence in her eyes as she absorbed the cruelty around her, not with tears, but with a pensive, almost analytical calm. There was a strength in her that the glittering, brittle beauties of the ballroom could not comprehend. Tonight the whispers were particularly loud. Alistair's sharp hearing caught snippets of the conversation. Father is in debt up to his ears. They say her mother was an actress, desperate for any man who will have her. All lies he knew. His secretary, a man of terrifying efficiency, had provided him with a discreet summary of every notable family this season. The Ainsworths were solvent, if not wealthy. Dr. Ainsworth was a respected physician who had published scholarly articles. Mrs. Ainsworth had been the daughter of a country squire. The lies were as cheap and flimsy as the characters of those who spread them. He watched as Cressida, emboldened by the lack of consequence, took a step closer to Beatrice's position, her voice rising just enough to carry. One must pity her. To come all this way only to be a wallflower. Perhaps she should simply return to the countryside and marry a farmer. It's likely the best she can hope for. The circle of ladies tittered. Beatrice's knuckles were white where she gripped her dance card. For a moment her composure wavered, her shoulders slumping just a fraction. She looked utterly desperately alone. Something shifted in Alistair. It was an unfamiliar sensation, a low thrum of protective anger that cut through his usual icy detachment. He had seen men break on the battlefield with more fortitude than these pampered aristocrats possessed. He had seen true courage, and it had nothing to do with fancy titles or sharp wit. It looked, he realized, a great deal like the quiet woman standing by the marble column, weathering a storm of whispered words. He pushed himself away from the wall. The movement, though slight, caused a ripple in his immediate vicinity. Mothers with eligible daughters suddenly straightened their posture. Men who sought his financial or political favor cleared their throats, hoping for a glance of acknowledgement. He ignored them all. His path was direct, cutting a straight line through the swirling sea of silk and satin. Dancers parted before him, conversations faltered, and heads turned. The Duke of Beaumont never mingled. He never sought anyone out. For him to be moving with such purpose was an event in itself. The whispers changed their tune, shifting from Beatrice's perceived failings to the Duke's unprecedented behavior. Beatrice, lost in her own miserable thoughts, didn't notice the change in the room's atmosphere until the whispers around her died abruptly. The silence was so sudden it was more jarring than the noise. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. The Winter Duke, the most powerful and unapproachable man in all of England, was standing directly in front of her. He was taller than she had imagined, a towering, formidable presence that blotted out the rest of the ballroom. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes intense. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The world for Beatrice Ainsworth had shrunk to the space of a few feet. The jeering faces of Lady Cressida and her friends, the oppressive heat of the ballroom, The saccharine music of the orchestra, it all faded into a distant hum. All that existed was the severe, imposing figure of the Duke of Beaumont, whose stormy eyes were fixed solely on her. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She ran through a frantic list of possible transgressions. Was she standing in his preferred spot? Had she unknowingly committed some grave social error? Perhaps her simple gown offended his ducal sensibilities. She curtsied a gesture that was deeper and more flustered than she intended. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair Beaumont inclined his head a fraction of an inch, a minimalist acknowledgement that was somehow more commanding than a full bow. He did not smile. His face remained a mask of aristocratic indifference, yet his eyes held a focus that was anything but. His gaze swept over her, taking in the trembling hands, clutching her empty dance card, and the flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. He then let his eyes drift for a single pointed second to the cluster of women behind her. Lady Cressida's smug smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Miss Ainsworth," the Duke said. His voice was a low baritone, clear and cold as a winter stream cutting through the stunned silence of the room. He knew her name. The thought was so shocking that Beatrice almost forgot her manners. How could a man like him, a duke who conversed with princes and ministers, possibly know the name of a penniless wallflower? You know who I am." "Your Grace," she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "I make it my business to be informed," he stated, simply offering no further explanation. The statement was a quiet assertion of power. He was not a man who stumbled through life. He was a man who observed, analyzed, and knew. He extended a gloved hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Beatrice stared at it for a full second, her mind failing to process its meaning. It was an offer, a request. He was asking for something. Then her eyes darted down to the dance card she was crushing in her fist. "Your card, Miss Ainsworth," he prompted, his voice devoid of impatience, but firm in its command. Numbly mechanically, she unfurled her fingers and handed him the small, pristine piece of cardstock. He took it from her, his gloved fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her, a spark of warmth against the chill of her anxiety. He produced a small pencil from an inner pocket of his immaculate black tailcoat, and without a word wrote his name, Beaumont, in a strong, decisive hand across the line for the next waltz. And the one after that. A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. 2 dances. To claim 2 dances with an unmarried lady was a significant gesture. It was a mark of pointed, unambiguous interest. For the Duke of Beaumont, a man who had not been seen dancing in years to do so, was tantamount to a royal declaration. He handed the card back to her. "I believe the orchestra is beginning the next set." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an expectation that she would comply. Beatrice could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, a weight of speculation and disbelief, far heavier than the scorn she had endured earlier. Lady Cressida's face was a picture of apoplectic fury, her complexion mottling. This was not how the evening was supposed to go. The fox was meant to be torn apart by the hounds, not rescued by the lion. Beatrice found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Your Grace, you mustn't feel obligated. I am quite content to observe." Alistair's expression remained unchanged, but a new light flickered in his eyes, something akin to respect. "I am never obligated, Miss Ainsworth. I do as I please." He offered her his arm. Shall we to refuse would be an insult of unimaginable proportions. To accept felt like stepping off a cliff into an unknown sea. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she placed her fingertips on his arm. The fabric of his coat was fine wool, the muscle beneath it hard as oak. As he led her towards the dance floor, the crowd parted for them, as if by magic. The whispers followed no longer of mockery, but of frantic, astonished inquiry. When they reached the center of the floor and he turned to face her, placing a hand on her waist, Beatrice felt a fresh wave of panic. She was a competent dancer, taught by a patient instructor in the countryside, but she was by no means an expert. To dance with a duke under the scrutinizing gaze of the entire ton felt like a test she was destined to fail. "Your Grace, I must confess, I am not the most accomplished dancer," she admitted in a low voice, her eyes downcast. "Then I shall endeavor not to tread on your feet," he replied, his tone so dry it might have been sarcasm, but she sensed no mockery in it. "Look at me, Miss Ainsworth. Not at the floor. Not at the vultures on the periphery." She lifted her gaze to his. Up close, his eyes were not merely cold. They were deep and complex, with flecks of grey and blue, like a turbulent ocean. There was a weariness in them, a shadow of things seen and endured, that made him seem far older than his 30 years. In that moment, she felt a strange, inexplicable connection, a recognition of a fellow soul who did not belong in this glittering, superficial world. The music swelled, and he guided her into the graceful, sweeping movements of the waltz. To her astonishment, he was a superb dancer, precise, strong, and effortlessly confident. He led with such clarity that she found herself following his steps with an ease she had never known. She didn't stumble. She didn't falter. For the first time all evening, she felt a sense of grace, of belonging right there in the arms of the most intimidating man in England. They danced in silence for the first few turns, the unspoken conversation of their movements saying more than words. The Duke's grip was firm but respectful, his posture perfect. He moved with a military precision that had been refined into an aristocratic elegance. He was not dancing for pleasure, she realized. He was making a statement. He was using his presence, his power, to shield her. Why, she finally whispered the question, escaping her against her better judgment. His eyes met hers. "Why what, Miss Ainsworth? Why are you doing this?" He considered the question for a moment, as he spun them in a perfect arc. "Let us say I have an aversion to blatant injustice," he said, his voice low, and meant for her ears alone. "And I find manufactured cruelty to be a tedious sport." His answer was so direct, so devoid of the usual social platitudes, that it took her breath away. He saw. He had seen everything, and he had not approved. He was not saving her out of pity, but out of principle. The realization was a balm to her wounded pride. As the waltz concluded, a smattering of polite applause broke out, though it was laced with confusion. Before Beatrice could retreat back to the safety of her column, the orchestra struck up the next piece. The Duke had not released her. He simply held her in place, waiting to begin again. The second dance was different. The initial shock had worn off both for Beatrice and for the onlookers. Now a more intense, calculated scrutiny took its place. This was no mere whim. This was a deliberate choice. Beatrice could feel the heat of Cressida's glare from across the room. "You have made an enemy of Lady Cressida." Vance, Beatrice noted quietly, a hint of wryness in her tone. A corner of Alistair's mouth quirked a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement that was the closest thing to a smile she had seen on his face. One cannot have a surplus of enemies. It keeps one alert. She found herself smiling in return, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "A military perspective, Your Grace." "A practical one," he corrected. "The ballroom can be as treacherous as any battlefield. The weapons are simply different." When the second dance finally ended, He escorted her not to the edge of the floor, but all the way back to her chaperone. Mrs. Gable looked as though she might faint from the sheer shock of it all. The Duke gave another of his curt, formal bows. Miss Ainsworth, Mrs. Gable. He acknowledged them both before turning and walking away, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged, leaving Beatrice in the centre of a storm of his own making. The shield was gone, and she was left to face the consequences. The silence he left in his wake was quickly filled by a furious, buzzing swarm of whispers, more intense and speculative than ever before. The Duke's intervention was not the salvation Beatrice might have hoped for. It was instead like pouring oil onto a fire. The gossip didn't cease. It merely changed its target and intensified its venom. Before she had been an object of scornful pity. Now she was an object of suspicion and jealous rage. The narrative woven in the drawing rooms and card parlours of Mayfair was crafted primarily by a furious Lady Cressida Vance. Cressida, who had considered the Duke her own personal prize to be won, could not fathom that he would choose to honour a woman like Beatrice. Therefore there had to be a sinister explanation. She's a schemer, Cressida declared to a rapt audience at a tea held by Viscountess Stirling, a cunning little viper. She must have uncovered some secret, some piece of blackmail to hold over the Duke's head. Why else would a man of his stature even look at her? This version of events was far more palatable to the tongue than the simple truth. It was easier to believe in feminine machinations and blackmail than to accept that the Winter Duke, a man who epitomized their values of wealth and lineage, had been genuinely impressed by a woman of little consequence. The lie spread like a contagion. Within a week, Beatrice Ainsworth was no longer just the poor wallflower. She was a manipulative enchantress, a social climber of the most dangerous sort. The whispers that had once been confined to the corners of ballrooms now became bold, open declarations. She would enter a room, and conversations would stop, replaced by hostile stares. Invitations that had trickled in before the Salisbury ball dried up completely. Mrs. Gable, her chaperone, was beside herself, with worry, her face a constant mask of distress. Beatrice bore it with the same quiet fortitude she had always shown, but the strain was beginning to take its toll. The fortress of her dignity was under constant siege. At night, in the privacy of her modest rented rooms, she would allow the mask to slip her mind, replaying every sneer, every turned shoulder. The Duke's gesture, which had felt so powerful and validating in the moment, now seemed like a cruel joke, a brief taste of acceptance before a far greater plunge into ostracism. He had not been seen in society since that night, leaving her to navigate the treacherous waters he had stirred. The culmination of Cressida's campaign came at the Venetian masquerade at Vauxhall Gardens, one of the most anticipated events of the season. Beatrice had almost refused to attend, but Mrs. Gable had insisted, arguing that to hide away would be to admit defeat. And so Beatrice found herself there, wearing a simple silver mask and a pale blue gown, feeling more exposed than ever. The gardens were a magical labyrinth of light and shadow, but the atmosphere was thick with menace. Behind the anonymity of their masks, the gossips felt even more emboldened. Beatrice had been there less than an hour when she overheard the lie, the one that was designed not just to wound her, but to utterly destroy her. She was taking a moment of respite near the orchestra pavilion when she heard Lord Ashworth, a known associate of Cressida's family, speaking in a loud, deliberate voice to a group of influential gentlemen. "I have it on good authority," Ashworth said, puffing out his chest, "that the woman Ainsworth is not who she claims to be. A friend of mine who travelled through the north last year swears he saw her. Said she was working in a tavern of ill repute near the Scottish border. A barmaid, can you imagine, and one who was overly friendly with the patrons. A collective intake of breath came from the group. The accusation was monstrous. It was a direct assault on her virtue, the only currency a woman of her standing truly possessed. To be labelled a common barmaid and implicitly a fallen woman was a social death sentence. "Are you certain Ashworth another man?" asked, a salacious glint in his eye. "As certain as I'm standing here," Ashworth boomed. He said her name wasn't Ainsworth then, of course, but he saw her face clearly. When he saw her at the Salisbury ball, he recognized her immediately. The family must have scraped together some money to buy her a new identity, and are trying to pass her off as a lady. A desperate gamble to entrap a wealthy husband. The poison spread instantly. The lie was so specific, so audacious, that it had the ring of truth for those who wanted to believe it. It explained everything: her lack of social grace, her poverty, and most damningly, the Duke's strange behavior. Obviously, she had somehow entrapped him with her common wiles. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. Her legs felt weak, and she gripped the back of a bench to steady herself. This was no longer about her dress or her quiet nature. This was an attack on her name, her family, her honor. She saw Cressida nearby, her peacock-feathered mask, doing little to conceal the triumphant smirk on her face. She had orchestrated this. This was her checkmate. Beatrice turned and fled, pushing her way through the masked revelers, ignoring the curious looks she received. She didn't stop until she was outside the gardens, her chest heaving as she gasped for the cool night air. Mrs. Gable found her moments later, her face pale with horror. She too had heard the rumor. The days that followed were a blur of misery. They were publicly cut by people who had, a few weeks prior, at least offered them a civil nod. At a morning musicale, the hostess pointedly asked them to leave, stating that she couldn't have women of questionable character in her home. Their landlord hinted that they should seek lodging elsewhere. They were effectively excommunicated from society. Dr. Ainsworth wrote a frantic letter from the countryside, having heard a third-hand account of the scandal. He was apoplectic, demanding the name of the man who had slandered her, ready to defend his daughter's honor, even if it meant ruin. Beatrice wrote back, begging him to do nothing, knowing that any action from her powerless father would only add fuel to the fire and lend credibility to the lies. She felt utterly trapped, her future a blank wall. No respectable man would have her now. Her one season, purchased at such great cost to her family, had not just failed. It had ended in catastrophic disgrace. The worst part was her powerlessness. She had no way to fight back. Her word meant nothing against that of a viscount like Ashworth, especially when his story was amplified by the most popular belle of the season. She thought of the Duke, a bitter resentment mixing with the memory of their dance. He had swooped in, shone a brilliant spotlight on her, and then vanished, leaving her to be scorched by its beam. He had done as he pleased, just as he'd said, and it seemed that pleasing him involved creating a disaster and then taking no responsibility for it. He had acted on a whim, on a point of principle, without a single thought for the consequences she would have to face. He was just like the rest of them, she thought, with a surge of anger, a powerful man playing games with the lives of lesser beings. The Winter Duke had lived up to his name, leaving her in a cold, desolate landscape of his making. She was alone, and utterly, irrevocably ruined. While Beatrice Ainsworth's world was collapsing, Duke Alistair Beaumont was 200 miles away at his primary estate in the Peak District. Beaumont Hall was a formidable fortress of grey stone, a place as imposing and unyielding as its master. He had not fled London out of indifference. He had retreated to his sanctuary to wage a war. The moment his boots had crossed the threshold of his London residence after the Salisbury ball, he had summoned his secretary, Mr. Harrison, a man whose quiet demeanour belied a mind as sharp as a razor and a network of informants that would be the envy of any spymaster. Miss Beatrice Ainsworth Alistair had said, standing by the fireplace in his study. "I want to know everything. Not the society version. The truth. I have the preliminary file you requested last month," Your Grace Harrison replied, already pulling a slim folder from his satchel. Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly. The one containing the details of her father, Dr. Robert Ainsworth, the very same, Your Grace. Alistair took the folder and opened it. Inside were papers detailing Dr. Ainsworth's life and career, a list of his published medical treatises and financial records confirming his modest but stable income. But tucked at the back was a military report flagged for the Duke's attention. It was a battlefield assessment from the Peninsular War, specifically from the aftermath of the Battle of Salamanca. Alistair's gaze lingered on one particular paragraph. It described how a young Captain Beaumont, separated from his regiment and suffering from a severe shrapnel wound to his leg, had been found near death by a civilian field doctor who had volunteered his services to the army. This doctor, working with primitive tools and under constant threat of enemy fire, had performed a difficult surgery that saved the captain's leg from amputation and very likely his life from the subsequent infection. The doctor's name was Robert Ainsworth. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment, the memory as vivid as if it were yesterday. The searing pain, the stench of blood and gunpowder, the grim-faced surgeon who had refused to give up on him. He remembered Dr. Ainsworth's calm, reassuring voice and his skilled, steady hands. When the then Marquis Alistair's father had offered the doctor a handsome reward, Ainsworth had refused it. "Saving a life is its own reward, my lord," he had said. "Just promise me you will live it well." Alistair's father had pressed, and Ainsworth had finally relented, not for himself but for his only child, a young daughter named Beatrice. "If my daughter should ever find herself in need," he had said, "perhaps you might remember me then." The old Duke had given his word. Alistair had inherited that promise, along with the dukedom. He had kept a distant, discreet watch over the Ainsworth family for years. He knew Beatrice was intelligent, well-read, and possessed of her father's quiet integrity. When he learned she was to have a London season, he had anticipated the challenges she would face, and had resolved to ensure she was treated with the respect she deserved. His dance with her had been a calculated first move, a public signal of his favor, designed to quell the petty gossip. He had underestimated the sheer viciousness of his peers. He had assumed a clear display of his interest would be enough. Instead, it had provoked them to new heights of cruelty. When news of the Vauxhall rumor reached him, via an urgent courier from Harrison, his cold anger solidified into something hard and dangerous. The lie was not just an attack on Miss Ainsworth. It was an attack on the honor of a man who had saved his life. They had mistaken his quiet observation for inaction. It was a grave miscalculation. Harrison Alistair said, his voice dangerously low, as he stood in the cavernous library of Beaumont Hall. "Lord Ashworth. What is his weakness?" Harrison didn't blink. "He has considerable gambling debts, Your Grace. Primarily to a Mr. Silas Croft, who owns the Cerberus Club. Ashworth has mortgaged his estate twice. A third would see him ruined. And Lady Cressida Vance. Her father, the Earl of Danbury, is desperately trying to secure a political appointment as an ambassador. His influence is waning, and he needs the Duke of Wellington's support." "Support you could easily sway, Your Grace." Alistair nodded slowly, the pieces of his strategy falling into place. "I want you to acquire Ashworth's debt from this Croft. All of it. Pay whatever is necessary. I also want a full account of the Danbury family's finances and political dealings. I want to know where every skeleton is buried, and find the man Ashworth supposedly spoke to, the one who recognized Miss Ainsworth." "That man does not exist, Your Grace," Harrison said with certainty. "I know," Alistair replied, "but I want you to find the man they will claim it was. I want you to trace the path of this lie back to its source. Use any resources you require." For the next week, Beaumont Hall became a command centre. Couriers came and went at all hours. Alistair barely slept, fueled by black coffee and a cold fury. He worked with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to plan military campaigns. This was not a social squabble. It was an operation, and he would ensure total victory. Harrison's agents were terrifyingly effective. They discovered that Lord Ashworth had been promised the forgiveness of a significant gambling debt owed to the Earl of Danbury in exchange for spreading the rumour about Beatrice. The Earl, in turn, was pushing his daughter Cressida towards the Duke so aggressively because his own finances were in a perilous state. He needed her to marry into a fortune like Alistair's to save his family from ruin. They also uncovered a more personal, pathetic motive. Years ago, Dr. Ainsworth had publicly discredited a miracle cure being peddled by a cousin of the Earl of Danbury, exposing the man as a charlatan and costing the family a great deal of money and public face. The grudge was old, but it had festered. Beatrice was paying the price for her father's integrity. By the end of the week, Alistair held a thick portfolio of evidence. He had promissory notes for Ashworth's debts, sworn affidavits from servants who had overheard Cressida and her father plotting, and a detailed ledger of the Earl's precarious financial situation. He had everything he needed to utterly dismantle them. His final instruction to Harrison was simple: ensure that Lady Cressida Vance, her father the Earl of Danbury, and Lord Ashworth all receive invitations to the Duchess of Richmond's annual ball. Make it clear that my attendance is guaranteed. The Duchess of Richmond's ball was the pinnacle of the social season, an event so exclusive that an invitation was a command. No one would dare refuse. It was the perfect stage for what he had planned. He stood before a portrait of his father that hung in the long gallery. The old Duke's eyes, stern and unyielding, seemed to watch him. He had made a promise. A debt of honour was to be paid, and Alistair Beaumont always paid his debts. He would not just clear Beatrice Ainsworth's name, he would raise it so high that no one would ever dare to slander it again. The winter was about to break, and a storm was coming to London. The night of the Duchess of Richmond's ball arrived, and a nervous energy crackled through the grand houses of London. The news that the Duke of Beaumont would be in attendance had spread like wildfire, elevating the event from a societal pinnacle to a historical moment. He had been absent for weeks, and his return, coupled with the ongoing scandal surrounding his last public appearance, was the only topic of conversation. For Beatrice Ainsworth, the invitation had been a source of sheer terror. It had arrived via the Duke's personal footman, a gesture of such pointed significance that it could not be ignored. Mrs. Gable had insisted they must go, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a desperate flickering hope. "This means something, Beatrice," she had whispered. "He would not summon you to your own execution." Beatrice was not so sure. Dressed in a simple gown of deep emerald velvet, one of her last and finest dresses, a painful reminder of her family's initial hopes, she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. As they entered the magnificent, crowded ballroom of Richmond House, a hush fell over the assembly. Every eye turned to her. The stares were no longer just mocking. They were filled with a predatory curiosity. They were all waiting to see what would happen, to witness the final act of her social demise. She found a small, empty space near the French doors that led to the gardens, her back literally against the wall. She could see them all. Lady Cressida, resplendent in gold satin, holding court like a queen, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. Her father, the Earl of Danbury, stood beside her looking smug. Lord Ashworth was nearby, laughing loudly, with a group of men basking in the attention his slander had brought him. They looked so confident, so secure in their power. Then the Duke of Beaumont arrived. His entrance was not loud or ostentatious, but the effect was instantaneous. A wave of silence rolled through the room as he appeared at the top of the grand staircase. Dressed in severe black and white, he was an embodiment of stark, uncompromising power. He paused for a moment, his stormy eyes sweeping across the entire ballroom, missing nothing. His gaze was cold, appraising, and utterly commanding. For a heart-stopping second, his eyes met Beatrice's from across the room, and he gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of reassurance, but of intent. He descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace. The Duchess of Richmond, a formidable matriarch, moved to greet him, but he offered her only a brief, courteous bow before continuing his inexorable path into the heart of the room. The crowd parted before him. Mothers pushed their daughters forward, only to be met with an icy indifference that made them recoil. He ignored them all. He ignored the fawning politicians, the hopeful dandies, and the fluttering debutantes. His target was obvious. He walked directly towards Lady Cressida's glittering circle. Cressida's heart leaped. This was it, her victory. He had come to his senses. He was coming to acknowledge her the rightful choice. A brilliant, practiced smile lit up her face. "Your Grace," she purred, curtsying deeply. "We were beginning to fear you had abandoned us for the countryside." Alistair stopped a few feet from her. He looked down at her, his expression as remote and unforgiving as a winter landscape. "Lady Cressida," he said, his voice carrying in the expectant silence. He did not return her smile. His gaze then moved to her father, Lord Danbury, then to the preening Lord Ashworth. Ashworth. He acknowledged each of them, by name, his tone flat and devoid of warmth. The air grew thick with tension. This was not the greeting they had expected. Then he did the most insulting thing possible. He turned his back on them, completely and utterly. He turned, and without a single backward glance, he began to walk towards the far side of the room, where Beatrice stood, frozen by the doors. The collective gasp was audible. It was a public shunning of the highest order, a deliberate and brutal dismissal of the season's belle and her powerful allies. Cressida's smile vanished her face, contorting in an expression of pure disbelief, which quickly curdled into rage. Beatrice watched him approach her heart, hammering against her ribs. Every step he took felt like a drumbeat, counting down to some unknown fate. He did not stop until he was standing before her, creating a small island of silence around them in the sea of stunned onlookers. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice the same calm, low baritone she remembered. "You look pale." "I trust you are well." "I am. Surprised to see you." "Your Grace." She managed her voice tight. "I had business to attend to," he replied cryptically. "But it is concluded now." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the icy control in his eyes. It was a flicker of profound, sincere regret. "I owe you an apology. My actions at the Salisbury ball were ill-conceived. I sought to offer you a shield, and instead handed my enemies a sword to use against you. It was a tactical error for which you have paid the price. I am here tonight to correct it." Before she could process his words, he offered her his arm. "I believe you have not yet danced this evening. I would be honored if you would grant me the first waltz." Her mind screamed at her to refuse to run from this man who had inadvertently caused her so much pain, but her heart, betrayed by the glimmer of sincerity in his eyes, urged her to trust him. She looked past him at the faces of her tormentors, at their shock and fury, and a small spark of defiance ignited within her. She had nothing left to lose. Slowly she placed her hand on his arm. "I would be delighted, Your Grace." As he led her onto the dance floor, the whispers erupted anew, a frantic, confused roar. This was not just a repeat of the Salisbury ball. This was a declaration of war. He was not just dancing with her. He was choosing her publicly and defiantly over everyone else. He pulled her into the waltz, his grip firm and steadying. "They will not be silent for long," he said, his voice low. "But do not be afraid. Stay by my side." They moved across the floor, a solitary island of grace in a swirling vortex of scandal. Beatrice felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For weeks she had been drowning. Now it felt as if she were in the eye of the storm, and in the arms of the man who commanded the winds, she was, for the first time, utterly safe. She met his gaze and held it a silent pact passing between them. The gambit was underway. The battle for her honor had begun. As they danced, the ballroom seemed to shrink, the hundreds of guests becoming a single multi-headed beast of judgment, its eyes fixed on them. The orchestra played on, but the music was a discordant backdrop to the rising tension. Alistair moved with a focused intensity, his hand a firm, reassuring pressure on her back. He kept his eyes on hers, a silent command to trust him. Their waltz was not a social pleasantry. It was a performance, a deliberate spectacle. And just as Alistair had predicted, their enemies would not remain silent for long. As they swirled near the edge of the dance floor, close to where Lady Cressida and her allies had regrouped, Lord Ashworth stepped forward. He was flushed with wine and wounded pride, a dangerous combination. Well, he sneered, his voice loud enough to cut through the music. "The Duke seems to have a taste for tavern wenches. Tell me, Your Grace, does she serve you as well as she served the drunken soldiers up north?" The music faltered. A dozen dancers stumbled to a halt. The insult, crude and direct, hung in the air like poison gas. Beatrice froze in Alistair's arms, the blood rushing in her ears. The public humiliation was absolute. This was it. The final, fatal blow. But Alistair did not flinch. He did not release her. Instead, he stopped dancing and slowly, deliberately turned to face Lord Ashworth. He still held Beatrice's hand, his thumb stroking hers in a small, grounding gesture only she could feel. "Repeat that, Ashworth," the Duke said. His voice was not loud, but it was filled with such lethal calm that it seemed to suck all the air from the room. It was the voice of a commander on a battlefield, the voice of a man who held the power of life and death. Ashworth, realizing he had perhaps gone too far, tried to bluster his way through. "I merely repeated what is common knowledge. The lady's reputation is sullied. Everyone knows it." "Do they?" Alistair's gaze swept the room, and dozens of people shrank back from his icy glare. "Then let us dispense with common knowledge and concern ourselves with the truth." He released Beatrice's hand and took a half-step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her, a human shield. "You claim, Lord Ashworth, that Miss Ainsworth was a barmaid in the north. You claim this on the word of a friend who recognized her. I should very much like to meet this friend." "What is his name?" Ashworth paled. He wishes to remain anonymous." How convenient, the Duke said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Perhaps because he does not exist. This story was not told to you. It was fed to you by the Earl of Danbury in exchange for wiping clean a gambling debt of £5,000, a debt which I might add I now own." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The Earl of Danbury turned a sickly shade of grey. Ashworth looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Alistair was just getting started. He gestured to the entrance where his secretary, Mr. Harrison, now stood, holding a portfolio. "In fact, I own all of your debts, Ashworth. The mortgages on your land, the notes owed to every moneylender in London. With a single word, I could have you in a debtor's prison by sunrise. So I will ask you once more, and I advise you to choose your next words with extreme care. Where did you hear this story, Ashworth's bravado shattered? He shot a desperate, pleading look at the Earl, who stared stonily ahead. Trembling, the Viscount pointed a shaking finger. It was him. The Earl, he and his daughter, they told me what to say. All eyes now turned to Lady Cressida and the Earl of Danbury. Cressida's face was a mask of fury. This is outrageous. An absurdity. The man is a liar and a debtor. You cannot possibly take his word over ours. Oh, I do not rely solely on his word, Alistair said smoothly. He took a document from Harrison. I have here a sworn statement from one of your own maids, Lady Cressida, who overheard you and your father concocting this slanderous tale. She describes the conversation in meticulous detail, including your father's lament that Dr. Ainsworth, a man of great integrity, once cost your family a fortune by exposing your cousin's fraudulent medical tonic. The revelation of the old grudge, the petty rotten core of their hatred, landed with devastating force. The pieces clicked into place for everyone listening. This was not a matter of a woman's reputation. It was a long, festering, dishonorable vendetta. The Earl of Danbury lunged forward. This is an attack on my family. On my honor, I demand satisfaction. Beaumont Alistair looked at him with utter contempt. You speak of honor. You who would use your daughter as a bargaining chip to secure a political post. You are wholly unqualified for. You who would destroy an innocent woman's life to settle an old score, you have no honor left to defend. He turned to address the silent, gaping crowd. The lies you have so eagerly consumed about Miss Ainsworth are just that lies, the product of a desperate, corrupt family and their pathetic lackey. His gaze fell back to Beatrice, who was watching him, her eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and dawning admiration. He walked back to her side, his demeanor softening as he looked at her. The truth about Miss Ainsworth is this, he said, his voice now resonating with a new, powerful emotion. Her father is Dr. Robert Ainsworth, a man of science and courage who during the war in Spain saved my life on the battlefield when others had left me for dead. He is a better man than any 10 of the titled fools in this room, and his daughter possesses that same courage, that same unshakable integrity. For weeks she has endured your scorn, your whispers, and your vile fabrications, with a dignity you could not possibly comprehend. He took her hand, lifting it to his lips and brushing a soft kiss across her knuckles. The gesture was tender, intimate, and it silenced every last whisper. He then turned back to the room, his eyes blazing, and delivered the final decisive blow. You have spoken ill of her all season. You have judged her, slandered her, and sought to ruin her. So let me be perfectly clear. Your season of whispers is over. You are looking at the woman who has honored me by accepting my proposal of marriage. You are looking at the future Duchess of Beaumont. The Duke's declaration, the future Duchess of Beaumont, froze the ballroom in stunned silence. Before the very people who had scorned her could surge forward with false congratulations, Alistair guided Beatrice from the suffocating room and into the cool tranquillity of the moonlit gardens. By a quiet stone fountain, she turned to him, her voice trembling with emotion. You should not have done that, Your Grace. Defended you? He asked, his brow furrowed. Lied, she clarified the word sharp with pain, to announce a proposal that was never made. Was I merely a pawn to ensure your victory? The formidable mask of the Winter Duke seemed to fall away, revealing a startling vulnerability. It was not a lie. Beatrice, he said softly, using her name for the first time. It was a premature announcement for which I apologize. But my intent was sincere. He explained the life debt he owed her father, a duty that had compelled him to watch over her. But what began as an obligation, he continued, his voice, earnest, became something more. I watched you endure their cruelty with a strength and dignity I have rarely witnessed. It turned to admiration, then to a profound respect. Tonight I knew I could not simply clear your name and leave you to face this world alone again. I want to be your shield always, not out of duty, but out of a deep desire to stand by your side. He gently took her hand. I am not a man of easy sentiment. My heart is a guarded place, but I offer you my unwavering loyalty and my deepest respect. The proposal is real, Beatrice. The question is, can you accept it, knowing it comes from a man as cold and complicated as me? Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, but they were of relief, not sorrow. She saw the truth in his gaze, a genuine offer, not of a title, but of a true partnership. A small, brilliant smile touched her lips. Alistair, she said, her voice clear and strong. I think a woman who can weather a London season can certainly handle a complicated duke. For the first time, Alistair Beaumont smiled back, a true transformative smile that chased away the last of the winter shadows, revealing the promise of a new dawn. And so the quiet wallflower, once scorned and slandered, began a new chapter, not as a victim, but as a victor beside a duke who saw the strength she always possessed. Their story reminds us that true worth is not found in the fickle whispers of a crowd, but in the quiet dignity of a resilient heart. It shows that sometimes the most formidable alliances are forged in the fires of adversity, and the greatest love stories are not about finding a perfect person, but about finding the one who sees you perfectly. If this story of karmic justice and unexpected love captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of strength and honor. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next dramatic story. Thank you for listening.